people would think that what Steve Jobs did was to come back into Apple and immediately create breakthrough innovations. But if you actually look at the historical record, the first thing he did was to reintroduce discipline. So when we looked at the leaders who built great companies, often from a position of real vulnerability, they were startups, they were small enterprises that went on to become great companies, we found that what separated them from those who didn't succeed in that environment was, think of it as a triangle. And in that triangle, there are three behaviors at each point of that triangle. One behavior is fanatic discipline. One behavior is empirical creativity. And one behavior is productive paranoia. Also, they didn't first do the iPad or the iPod or the iPhone or even the iMac. They initially focused on rebuilding around the big thing they already had, which was the Macintosh. Those first few years when he was back, it was, let's get the Mac working again. Let's make sure that we get that shored up. It wasn't until 4 years into their development that they took a small shot on what became the iPod. And what's very interesting is now we think about the empirical creativity. Did they sit there and say, we are going to introduce a revolutionary, pioneering breakthrough of a thing called the iPod and launch it as a giant, uncalibrated cannonball? No. Actually, what they did was they fired a small shot. The MP3 had happened outside their walls. They didn't even come up with it. And they said, but the thing is, we want to actually buy our music, and we would like to have something that's easier to organize the files. So they made this cool MP3 player initially for themselves. As that began to work, they began to get empirical validation, and the first iPod was a bullet. It wasn't even mentioned in the annual report as a major category. It was simply described as a natural extension of our digital hub strategy. And then they began to prove it, and people began to like it, and they kept it on the Mac, and then they created that neat file sharing system, and then they realized there was this issue that the music industry was having, and they began taking more bullets and proving it and having validation, and those bullets getting closer and closer to the ship, and then finally they realized this thing could go really big. That's when they concentrated all the gunpowder and cannonball. They moved it over to Windows-based systems, fired a huge cannonball, and then that was the iPod that all of us really ultimately had to have. Bullet, 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 cannonball. That's empirical creativity as opposed to just pioneering visionary genius.